I fought for my father's business for years. I poured my heart into it. And when he died, I thought I would finally get what I deserved. But in the end, he left it all to a half-sister I barely know. And that text shattered me. My name is Mia Anderson, and for as long as I can remember, I've been part of Anderson's Fine Carpentry, a business that my father, Daniel Anderson, started from the ground up. It wasn't just a company to me. It was my life. Growing up, I was always trying to prove myself to him. He wasn't a very open person, distant even. He'd give me the occasional compliment, but it was never enough. I always thought if I worked hard enough, if I did everything I could for the business, he would see that I was worthy, that I was his true heir. But the reality was far from what I'd imagined. I was in my mid-20s when I started managing the business. Dad was getting older, and his health wasn't what it used to be. There were times when I had to step in and take charge when everything seemed to be falling apart. I was there during the hard times, when we were barely making it, struggling to keep up with the competition. I didn't complain, I just worked harder. Late nights, early mornings, handling clients, keeping the team together. Nothing mattered more than saving Anderson's Fine Carpentry. I believed that if I kept it alive, my father would finally see that I was the one who deserved everything. But as time went on, I started to realize that his attention and praise weren't coming. He never saw me as more than just the person keeping the business running. And when he passed away, I thought all my hard work would finally pay off. The funeral was a blur of emotions. I remember feeling a mix of anger and sadness, standing there, knowing he had never truly given me the recognition I'd been longing for. But I told myself, once the will is read, I'll get what's rightfully mine. I had worked for it, after all. I had been the one who kept the business afloat for years. He had to see that. The day of the will reading came. I sat there waiting, with my brother Jack beside me. I had a feeling of hope, a belief that this was it, the moment when everything would finally fall into place. The lawyer began reading the will, and I sat straight up, eager to hear the words. I thought it would be something simple like Mia will take control of the business. But what came next hit me like a punch in the stomach. All assets, including the business and the family estate, will be inherited by Charlotte Anderson. Charlotte! I froze. I barely knew her. In fact, I had only met her once at Dad's funeral, and that was when she revealed that she was my half-sister. I thought the lawyer was joking at first. But the more he read, the more it sank in. The house, the business, everything, all left to Charlotte, a woman I had just met. I couldn't breathe. How could this be happening? I had spent years of my life working to keep the business alive, sacrificing so much, and in the end, it was left to someone who wasn't even a part of the family until now. The betrayal stung deeply, sharper than I could have ever imagined. I had given up my life, my time, my everything for this legacy, and it wasn't even mine. That's when my phone buzzed. I looked down at the screen, my hands shaking. It was a text from Charlotte. The words flashed across my screen. This is my legacy. I stared at the message for what felt like an eternity. I couldn't believe it. The text wasn't just cold. It was like a final punch to the gut. She didn't even know what it took for me to get the business to where it was. I wanted to scream, to throw my phone against the wall, but I didn't. I just sat there in silence, unable to understand how things had turned out this way. I didn't know how to feel. Betrayed, angry, confused, all of that, I guess. But more than anything, I was shattered. After all those years of dedication, it felt like nothing, like I had never mattered. Like everything I had done to protect the business wasn't enough to even get a share of it. I couldn't let it go. I needed to understand why. Why had Dad chosen her over me? Was I not enough? Was the business not enough for him to leave to the person who had worked so hard for it? The questions kept swirling around in my head, and I knew one thing. I wasn't going to walk away without answers. I couldn't just accept this, not after everything I had given. I had to find out why Charlotte was given everything. Was it really my father's choice, or was there something I didn't know? Something more to this story? The fact that Charlotte sent that message, it was like a final confirmation. This wasn't just a decision about money or property. This was personal. This was my father's legacy, and somehow Charlotte had taken it from me without even understanding what it meant to me. I had to face her. I couldn't keep living in the dark, feeling this betrayal. I had to find out the truth. So, I decided to meet her. I knew I couldn't avoid the situation any longer. I had to face Charlotte. She was the one who had taken everything, and while part of me wanted to just forget about it and move on, I knew that wasn't going to happen. I needed answers. I needed to understand how my father's mind worked, why he'd made that decision. I needed to know if Charlotte even understood what this meant for me, for the business, for the family. The first time I met Charlotte, it wasn't under the best circumstances. It was at my father's funeral, where we exchanged a few awkward words. I remember her looking so out of place, like a stranger in a family she didn't belong to. I'd always believed in the importance of family. To me, blood mattered. But she was a part of my father's life that I hadn't known about until it was too late. She didn't seem like she had any real attachment to our family, yet here she was standing with everything that I had worked so hard for. A part of me hated her for that. I didn't want to admit it, but I did. She wasn't the one who spent years in the trenches, keeping my father's dream alive. I had done that, not her. So when I decided to reach out to Charlotte, it wasn't just to get answers. It was to make her understand what it felt like to be betrayed. I wanted her to know that this wasn't just about money or property. This was about a father who made a decision that would affect both of our lives, and I wasn't sure I could move on without having closure. I texted her. The message was simple. We need to talk. When can we meet? I didn't know what to expect from her, but part of me thought that she might be just as confused about the will as I was. Maybe she didn't realize how much the business meant to me. Maybe, just maybe, she didn't want it either. It didn't take long for her to reply. She suggested a coffee shop halfway between both of our places, a neutral spot. I agreed, feeling a knot form in my stomach. Was I ready to face her? Could I really have a civil conversation about something that had shattered me so completely? I didn't know, but I had to try. I had no other choice. If I was ever going to heal from this, I had to get the answers I needed. The day of the meeting arrived, and I couldn't shake off the anxiety. I kept thinking about my father, about all the years I spent working, trying to make him proud, trying to prove that I was worthy. But now, after everything, I felt like I had failed. I was about to sit down with a woman who had no idea what it felt like to fight for something like I had, a woman who hadn't earned the right to call my father's business her legacy. Yet there she was, with everything, and I was left with nothing. I arrived at the coffee shop a few minutes early, trying to calm my nerves. The place was quiet, and I found a seat by the window, watching the traffic pass by. It was the perfect setting for what was about to be one of the most important conversations of my life. When Charlotte walked in, I couldn't help but notice how different she looked from the last time I saw her. She wasn't the awkward, distant figure I remembered. She seemed more put together, more comfortable in her own skin. It made me wonder, had she always been like this, or was it just the business that made her feel powerful? "Hey, Mia," she said, walking over with a small smile. It wasn't the kind of smile that made me feel welcome. It was polite, guarded, like we were strangers, which in many ways we were. "Hi," I said, forcing a smile back. "Thanks for meeting with me." She sat down across from me, and for a moment, neither of us said anything. The tension in the air was thick, almost suffocating. I had so many questions, but I didn't know where to begin. It felt like I was about to open Pandora's box, and once I started, I wasn't sure I could stop, but I had to. I had to know. Why? The question slipped out before I even realized I had spoken. My voice cracked as I said it. "Why did he leave everything to you? What did you do to deserve this?" Charlotte looked taken aback for a moment, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of vulnerability in her eyes. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat and let out a long breath. "I didn't ask for it, Mia," she said quietly, her voice surprisingly soft. "I didn't even know about any of this until I got the call from the lawyer. I was just as shocked as you." I stared at her, not sure whether to believe her or not. "You didn't know? You didn't know that he was going to leave everything to you?" "No," she answered, shaking her head. "He didn't even tell me about the business. I didn't know how much it meant to you." She paused, then added, I didn't know how much it meant to him either. Her words struck me harder than I expected. I had spent so many years fighting for my father's approval, assuming he always saw me as the one who would take over. But hearing Charlotte speak, I realized something I hadn't considered before. Maybe my father hadn't seen me the way I had seen myself. Maybe all this time, I had been fighting for something that was never mine to claim. I didn't want this, Mia, Charlotte continued, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't ask for the business or the house, but he left it to me. It's not something I'm happy about. Honestly, I feel like I'm just carrying a burden that I never asked for. I was taken aback. This wasn't the response I was expecting. I had come here angry, ready to confront her and demand answers. But now, I felt different. Her vulnerability, her honesty. It didn't fix the hurt, but it made me realize something I hadn't considered before. Charlotte wasn't my enemy. I didn't know about you, Charlotte, I said, my voice softening. I didn't know you had no idea about any of this. I didn't. I'm sorry. I wish I could give it back to you, but I don't think that would change anything. For a moment, we just sat there in silence, letting the weight of the situation settle between us. I didn't know how I felt yet, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't angry with her anymore. Maybe I was angry with my father for not telling me the truth, for leaving me in the dark. But Charlotte? She was just as much a victim in this as I was. I guess we both have a lot to figure out, I said, standing up. Charlotte nodded and we both left the coffee shop in different directions. The conversation didn't fix everything, but it gave me something I hadn't had in a long time. Hope. Not for the business, not for the legacy, but for me. And that was enough. The drive home was quiet, almost too quiet. My mind was racing with a mix of emotions, anger, sadness, confusion, but also something I hadn't expected, relief. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I was starting to understand the situation. Charlotte wasn't my enemy. She wasn't some outsider trying to take what was mine. She was just a woman who had inherited a legacy that she didn't even know how to handle. And for the first time in a long time, I was starting to see the truth. I had spent so much time in my life focusing on the idea of inheritance, of legacy. It was what my father had built, and I thought it was what I was meant to inherit. But now I realized it wasn't just about the business. It wasn't just about the money or the property. It was about the emotional weight we carry as a family. It was about the connections we make, not the things we leave behind. I walked into my apartment and dropped my bag on the floor, staring at the empty space around me. I had worked so hard for everything, but now I was left with nothing. No business to run, no father to make proud, no clear direction forward. It felt like I was standing in the middle of a storm, with no shelter in sight. But something had shifted inside me. I didn't want to be stuck in this anger anymore. I didn't want to keep fighting for something that wasn't meant for me. It was time to move on. But that wasn't easy. Letting go is never easy, especially when your whole life has been tied to something. The business was more than just a job for me. It was the closest thing I had to my father's approval. It was the last piece of him that I could hold on to, and now it was gone. But maybe that was the point. Maybe it was time for me to build something of my own, not in the shadow of my father's business, but something that truly belonged to me. I spent the next few days reflecting on everything. The anger that had burned in my chest for so long started to fade, replaced by a deep sense of clarity. I was angry at my father, sure, but mostly, I was angry at myself for waiting so long for his approval, for believing that the business was the only way to earn it. I had spent years trying to prove my worth, but in the end, I didn't need to prove anything to him or anyone else. I had a conversation with Jack that night. He knew how much the business meant to me, how much I had sacrificed to keep it going. But even he could see that this was the beginning of something new for me. You know, Mia, he said, his voice calm but firm, you've been carrying this weight for so long. Maybe it's time to let it go and see what else is out there. Maybe it's time for you to create something new. I knew he was right. I had spent so many years trying to hold on to the past that I hadn't considered what might be waiting for me in the future. And it wasn't just about the business. It was about me. It was about finding my own path, my own purpose, without depending on my father's legacy. I didn't need his approval anymore. I didn't need anyone's approval. The next few weeks were a blur of decision-making and self-reflection. I started to think about what I really wanted, not what I thought I should want, but what I truly needed to feel fulfilled. I knew I couldn't just walk away from the life I had built, but I also knew I couldn't keep living in the shadow of the past. I needed to find my own place in the world, outside of the expectations and the legacies that had been placed on me. I reached out to Charlotte again. I wasn't sure what I was expecting, maybe an apology or maybe some sort of closure, but what I got was something different. We met at the same coffee shop, and this time, it wasn't about anger or resentment. It was about understanding. She admitted that she didn't want the business, but she didn't know what else to do with it. She had never planned on being a part of it. It was just handed to her, and she had no idea how to carry that weight. "I don't want to take this from you, Mia," she said, her eyes filled with sincerity. "I don't know what to do with it. I never asked for any of this." I nodded, feeling the weight of her words. It was strange, but for the first time, I didn't feel angry. I felt empathetic. I understood her more now. She wasn't the one who had caused the rift. She had just inherited something that neither of us knew how to handle. And for a brief moment, I saw her as a person, not just as the competition or the reason for my pain. "I don't want it either," I said quietly. "I don't want the business. Not anymore." Her eyes widened in surprise. "You don't?" It's not my future. It's not my life. I spent so many years trying to hold on to something that doesn't belong to me anymore. It's time for me to build something new. For myself. She smiled, a genuine, warm smile. "I get it, and I'll help you, Mia. I know this wasn't easy for you, but I want to make this right. We can both move on from this, together." And just like that, something shifted. It wasn't about the business anymore. It wasn't about my father or the legacy he left behind. It was about finding peace. It was about letting go and starting fresh. The next few months were a blur of new beginnings. I sold off my father's business, knowing it was the right thing to do. I used the money to start something entirely different, a new venture that I could call my own. I wasn't doing it for anyone else. I was doing it for me. And that felt like freedom. It wasn't easy, but nothing worthwhile ever is. It was a journey of self-discovery, of understanding that my worth wasn't tied to my father's legacy or to a business that wasn't mine to carry. I was finally free to build my own legacy, and that, more than anything, was what I had been searching for all along. As the months passed, I found myself looking at life through a different lens. The anger that once consumed me had faded, replaced by a quiet sense of acceptance. Letting go of my father's business wasn't easy, but it was necessary. I had spent so many years fighting for something that wasn't meant for me, and finally accepting that truth was like taking a weight off my shoulders. For the first time in my life, I felt free. I think the hardest part wasn't selling the business or walking away from the legacy my father had left behind. It was coming to terms with the fact that I had spent so much time chasing after someone else's dream. My entire life had been built around the idea of living up to my father's expectations, of earning his approval. But in the end, that approval didn't matter. I was the one who needed to find peace with myself, not with my father. I started to build something new. It wasn't easy, and there were days when I doubted myself, wondering if I had made the right choice. But with each small victory, I felt more confident. I began to trust myself in ways I never had before. I was learning to build my own path, not one that was handed to me, but one that was entirely my own. The world was wide open, and I could go in any direction I wanted. It was liberating, but also terrifying. I had always been a fighter. I had fought for my father's business, fought for his approval, fought to be seen and heard. But now, I was fighting for myself, for my future. I knew it wouldn't be easy, but nothing worth having ever is. One of the first things I did after selling the business was invest in a new project. I had always been passionate about woodworking, just like my father, but I had never fully embraced it until now. I started a small woodworking studio, designing and crafting custom pieces. It wasn't about building a legacy. It wasn't about proving anything to anyone. It was about doing something I loved and creating something from scratch, just for me. It wasn't a huge success overnight, but it didn't need to be. What mattered was that I was doing something I was proud of. I wasn't looking for recognition or approval. I was doing it because it brought me joy, and that was enough. Over time, my studio grew, and so did my confidence. I began collaborating with local designers and interior decorators, creating unique, one-of-a-kind furniture pieces that were both functional and beautiful. My name slowly started to gain recognition in the local community, but this time, it wasn't because I was trying to live up to anyone else's expectations. It was because I had finally found my own voice, and people saw that. I didn't realize how much I had changed until one day I ran into Charlotte again. It had been a while since our last conversation, and honestly, I hadn't expected to see her again. But there she was, standing in front of my studio, looking unsure of herself, like she didn't quite belong. "I didn't know where else to go," she said softly when she saw me. "I've been thinking a lot about our conversation, and I wanted to say thank you." I looked at her, unsure of what she meant. "For what?" "For showing me that it's okay to let go," she said, her eyes sincere. I was so lost in trying to carry this business, trying to live up to Dad's legacy, that I never realized it wasn't mine to carry. "You were right, Mia. It's not about what we inherit, it's about what we create for ourselves." Her words hit me in a way I didn't expect. I realized that Charlotte, too, had been carrying the same burden I had. She had inherited something she never wanted and didn't know how to handle. But like me, she was learning to let go and build her own future. I felt a wave of compassion for her. She was no longer the enemy in my story. She was simply another person trying to figure things out. "You don't have to thank me," I said, a small smile playing on my lips. "We're both learning. We're both figuring out what's next." Charlotte smiled back, and in that moment I felt a sense of closure. It wasn't about the business. It wasn't about my father. It was about the two of us, realizing that we had both been carrying the weight of someone else's dreams. And now we were both free to create our own. Over time, our relationship grew stronger. We became more than just half-sisters. We became friends. We talked about our father, about the things we had never understood, about the things we wished we had known. We shared our experiences, our successes, and our failures. It was comforting to know that I wasn't alone in this journey anymore. We were both finding our way, not because we had to, but because we wanted to. I look back now and realize that the pain of losing the business, of losing my father's legacy, wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning. The ending of one chapter opened up the possibility for a new one. And in that new chapter, I found not only a new purpose, but also a new sense of peace. I'm not the person I was before. I'm stronger, more confident, and more sure of who I am. I don't need my father's approval anymore. I don't need anyone's approval. What matters now is that I am creating something that is mine, something that reflects who I am and what I believe in. And that's the legacy I'm building for myself. In the end, I learned that it's not about what you inherit from the past, but what you choose to create in the future. And for the first time in my life, I'm finally living for me.